Alright, so now we begin the study of Jaenisch Gambit. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, white plays bishop b5, the Spanish game, which is probably the most popular opening. Well, it is the most popular opening against e5, and black plays f5. So one of the main advantages here is that if you know the variations well enough, you will have small advantage in the preparation, because this is not played too often. Okay, and this section is devoted to the most obvious move, namely bishop takes c6, because this is the logical question: what happens if white simply takes the pawn? If white takes immediately on f5, then usually black plays e4, the knight is attacked and it cannot go to d4 or to e5, so white first should at least take the knight c6. Right, the bishop takes c6, and here, because of possibility of taking on f5, black should take with the pawn from d7, not from b7. D takes c6. And now white has a couple of possibilities. So first, what happens after knight takes e5? Black has to play queen d4. Now both the knight e5 and pawn e4 are hanging. White has multiple possibilities to play. For example, queen h5, that looks really dangerous, but after g6, white is in trouble. He has to take on g6, h takes g6, and now, unfortunately for white, and good for us, queen takes h8 doesn't work because rook is protected by the queen. That's one of the ideas of move queen d4. That's why it is so good, because queen h5 doesn't work. So after h takes g6, white can take on g6, of course, but black simply plays king d8. And now it's rather white king on e1 who is in danger, and not the black king, because white cannot really develop his pieces. Black wants to play knight e7 or bishop c5 attacking on f2. So the queen alone cannot do anything. And the queen on d4 is very active too. Also the rook on h8 plays on the h file. So this is not the position white wants to get after the opening. Which means queen h5 doesn't work. Okay, what else? Another possibility is to play knight f3, but that's simple. Queen takes e4, queen e2, queen takes e2, king takes e2, and bishop d6. For example, rook e1, knight e7, king f1, and short castle. And there is no way white can be better here, because simply black has absolutely no weaknesses. If he wants, he can play f4. Later he will be able to bring the bishop to f5 or even to g4. Black has two bishops, and as I said, the most important is that black has absolutely no weakness in his position. Pawn f5 is not a weakness. So, similar story we observe if instead of knight f3, white plays f4, black takes on e4, queen e2, black exchanges the queens, king takes e2, and bishop goes to d6. And now, if white plays d4, then black will play knight f6 with idea knight e4. After knight c3, bishop e6, put the bishop on d5, take control over the square e4, and have a very good position. And if white doesn't play d4, well, then he has to play d3, but here obviously black cannot have any problems. Simply bishop e6 and later knight f6 again. So, which means taking on e5 doesn't work because of queen d4. That's a good news. Let's see what else. Okay, so d takes c6, short castle. This is a possibility. F takes e4, knight takes e5, and again the same move, queen d4. And again, note that the queen from d4 will protect the rook, so that queen h5 again doesn't work. g6, knight takes g6, h takes g6, rook is protected, black wins. So queen h5 loses. Which means the knight has to go to g4, there is no other move. play h5, knight e3, bishop e6, knight c3 and long castle, creating pressure against pawn d2, pressure on the d file. White cannot play d3 anymore because square d3 is also under control. And what black wants is simply to play knight f6 and later maybe bishop d6, then queen e5, attack on h2 and attack the white king. So here black is better. Which means again white has to take extremely care, because one wrong move and you are done. Okay, so now to the main line after b takes c6, knight c3. So this looks strategically correct. So white simply develops pieces. He doesn't allow black to get any initiative in the center. If black takes on e4, white will be able to take with a knight, then play queen e2, d3, protecting the square e4. It is possible to take on e4, play knight f6 now, but there are better ways. I'll show you what they are. So knight f6 immediately. So now, if white takes, we can play e4. After queen e2, bishop takes f5, d3, black can play bishop b4, and black is fine. He takes e4, knight takes e4, and then queen goes to e7. No problem. So instead of taking on f5, white plays queen e2. So now again, if we take on e4, we can do it, but after knight takes e4, we will have some problems with the pawn e5. And the most important is we don't get any initiative here. So instead of this, black has two possibilities. He can play bishop c5 or bishop d6. So bishop c5 is considered to be the main line, but let me show you what happens after bishop d6, because this is also interesting. So if white takes on f5, for example, then we can simply castle. Now, white cannot take on e5 because bishop takes and rook e8. And if white plays short castles, then we can already take on f5 because pawn c2 hangs. And in the next move, we want to play rook e8 or e4 or bishop g4. So here we have enough counterplay. All our pieces are placed very well. But the problem of bishop d6 is that white can play d4. However, it turns out that surprisingly black can simply take on d4, and after e5 take even on c3. He takes f6, king f8, f takes g7, king takes g7. So now if white doesn't castle and plays, for example, bishop g5, then we simply can exchange queens or force the bishop to go back to e3, which makes no sense. So short castle, and now very strong move f4. And it turns out that in this position the king on g7 is actually not weak at all, because what black wants is to play rook e8, queen f6, put his bishop to f5 or g4, and since all our pieces are close to our king, and the king can go to h8, opening the g file, it turns out that it's rather black who can play on the king side than white. And the reason is that we have space advantage. Thanks to the move f4, we got space advantage and we could activate our white squared bishop. After bishop f5 or bishop g4, black is fine. And in addition, also white is underdeveloped at this moment. For example, b takes c3, rook e8, queen d3, and queen f6 with the idea bishop f5. I think black is even slightly better. Okay, so this is a possibility with bishop d6. There might be some other drawbacks. There must be a reason why people prefer to play bishop c5, and well, bishop c5 looks more solid, and I'll show you why. So it takes f5 and queen e7. The idea now is, our idea is to play e4, of course, but the idea is that white cannot take with the queen. Bishop takes f2, king takes f2, knight g4, and he loses the queen on e5. Hence, he can take with the knight, or he can play d3. So let's see what happens after knight takes e5. bishop takes f5, short castle. Long castle, black should take care with moves like bishop c2, because sometimes white can play d4, which is very unpleasant. So in addition, this is not so important because white can play d3 instead of short castle. So let's see what happens after long castle. Rook d3, rook h e8, rook e1. So we can get this position with different move orders. Maybe d3 immediately is slightly better to avoid these possibilities with taking on c2. So now rook d6. The idea is clear. We play against knight e5. We play on the e file. Bishop f4, rook e6, queen d2, and knight g4. This is a small tweak. Bishop g5, bishop takes f2, queen takes f2, knight takes f2, bishop takes e7, rook takes. Everything gets exchanged, equal amount of pawns. Black has fully equalized. So here there is no problem. And a similar situation we get after the move d3 in move number 8, instead of taking on e5. We have d3, bishop takes f5, short castle. Here long castle is also possible, but the problem with the long castle is always that white can take with the queen now. So here we need to be ready to play against this. That's why preferable to the long castle is the short castle. And the reason is that it's important to have the rook on the f file to attack the square f2. You will see it in a moment. Queen takes e5, queen takes e5, knight takes e5, rook a goes to e8. So now knight f3 is not good because of bishop g4 at least, attacking the knight, and the knight has to go somewhere else. Otherwise, white will get bad pawn structure. So knight c4 looks natural, but then black plays knight g4 with very dangerous threats against the square f2. It's important, as I said, to have the rook on the f file. White is forced to go to e3 with a bishop or with a knight, it doesn't matter. Knight takes e3, knight takes e3, bishop takes e3, f takes e3, and the rook takes e3. And again, everything got exchanged, and this position is drawish. So this concludes the section on bishop takes c6. The main thing that you need to remember here is actually only to take this pawn from d7, and then the rest will come automatically. So in this position, when white takes, you take with pawn from d7. Remember the idea with queen d4 whenever white takes on e5. And otherwise, you simply develop your pieces by playing knight f6, bishop c5 or bishop d6, and so on. Alright, I will see you in the next section where we continue studying other fourth moves for white.